Russia demands full control of four annexed regions, increasing pressure on peace talks. According to the Moscow Times, citing sources familiar with the Kremlin's strategy, Russia is pushing to gain full control of four territories it annexed from Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, as part of ongoing negotiations with the United States. Although Russian forces have not yet fully occupied any of these regions, the Kremlin insists that all areas must fall within Russia's administrative borders as stipulated in its constitution after the annexations. A Kremlin-connected official revealed that President Vladimir Putin sees retaining these territories as politically critical and is determined to solidify control over them at all costs. The Russian constitution has no mechanism for regions to secede. "We need all of Zaporizhzhia and all of Kherson," the source added. The Russian government also hopes that Washington will pressure Ukraine to withdraw completely from areas currently held by Russian forces. One possible scenario is that President Donald Trump could persuade Kyiv to pull back, or alternatively, that Moscow will continue using military force while negotiations drag on, a scenario seen as costly, particularly when it comes to crossing the Dnipro River to retake Kherson. Another option reportedly being considered by Moscow involves expanding territorial control in other Ukrainian provinces, such as Dnipropetrovsk or Sumy, and then proposing a territorial exchange for Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. However, Russian officials acknowledge this plan also comes with high risk. The Russian newspaper Kommersant reported that President Putin wants President Trump to officially recognize Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, along with Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, as part of Russia. In return, Putin would pledge not to claim sovereignty over other Ukrainian regions such as the strategic port city of Odessa. Currently, Russia controls approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory, including all of Crimea, 75% of Donetsk province, and 99% of Luhansk province. Moscow has repeatedly outlined its conditions for ending the war, which include: Ukraine must recognize Russia's sovereignty over the four annexed regions and Crimea. Ukrainian forces must fully withdraw from these territories. Ukraine must adopt permanent neutrality. The Ukrainian military must be reduced in size. Russia must be granted official status and usage rights in Ukraine. Kyiv has firmly rejected these conditions. Earlier this month, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal declared that Ukraine would not accept the loss of any territory, even if such a concession was requested by the US as part of a peace deal. He stressed that only the Ukrainian people have the authority to decide the fate of their country's territory.
European leaders meet to discuss Ukraine peace and defense amid US security shifts. On March 12th, defense leaders from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Italy convened in Paris to discuss peace efforts in Ukraine and the broader European defense strategy. The meeting comes as concerns grow over the US's evolving security commitments to the region. The defense ministers of these five nations, Europe's largest defense spenders, reaffirmed their continued support for Ukraine, even in the event of a ceasefire or peace agreement with Russia, but stopped short of committing to troop deployments for enforcing such an agreement. According to Defense News, when questioned about the potential deployment of troops to Ukraine, French Armed Forces Minister Sébastien Lecornu stated, "Media narratives evolve faster than diplomatic and military decision-making." NATO data projects that these five nations will collectively spend an estimated $314 billion on defense in 2024. 30-day ceasefire proposal and European pressure on Russia. The meeting followed the March 11th backing by the US and Ukraine of a 30-day ceasefire proposal in Saudi Arabia, which is currently awaiting a response from Russia. UK Defense Secretary John Healey underscored that the agreement between the US and Ukraine represents a crucial diplomatic step, adding that the responsibility now lies with Russian President Vladimir Putin to demonstrate a genuine commitment to peace. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius echoed these sentiments, emphasizing that the next move depends on Russia. He reiterated that European nations do not wish for a peace agreement reminiscent of the 1945 Yalta Conference, which divided Europe into spheres of influence. Pistorius also referenced the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine relinquished its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, and the 2014 to 2015 Minsk agreements, which established ceasefires but lacked concrete security assurances. Europe strengthens defense and reduces dependence on the U.S. French Defense Minister Le Cornu stressed that demilitarizing Ukraine is not an option, and that the best way to ensure the country's security is by reinforcing its armed forces. Meanwhile, Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz argued that supporting Ukraine is also about keeping Russia further away from European borders. Military chiefs from the 5 nations have begun drafting short and medium-term strategic scenarios to help policymakers shape a security framework for Ukraine. Immediate priorities include safeguarding the Black Sea region and protecting Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Le Cornu noted that European security faces ongoing threats from Russia, as well as the unpredictability of U.S. foreign policy shifts. U.S. strategic pivot spurs calls for European military autonomy. German Defense Minister Pistorius pointed out that America's strategic realignment away from Europe has been underway even before former President Donald Trump took office. However, the speed and extent of this shift remain uncertain. Pistorius urged European nations to move beyond adaptation and accelerate their efforts to bolster independent defense capabilities. He also called for a structured roadmap with the U.S. to ensure a phased transition of security responsibilities, minimizing potential gaps in defense readiness. UK Defense Secretary John Healey asserted that a stable Europe and a strong NATO also serve American interests. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin reaffirmed that increasing European defense capabilities does not equate to a U.S. withdrawal from Ukraine or European security commitments. The meeting took place amid growing discussions in the EU about reducing reliance on U.S. security support. On March 10th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen proposed forming a European Defense Union to strengthen the continent's military autonomy. Speaking in Brussels on March 9th, she emphasized that Europe has entered a new era of geopolitical challenges, where sovereignty and international commitments are increasingly subject to transactional diplomacy. U.S. continues to send military aid to Ukraine, a just distribution method. Shipments of U.S. military aid to Ukraine are reportedly continuing to arrive in Poland, albeit with some modifications compared to previous deliveries. According to Polish reporters, these shipments are still being transported to Zaporizhzhia airport, but the subsequent distribution process has changed. Weapons temporarily stored at U.S. military base in Poland. Previously, military equipment and weaponry for Ukraine were immediately transported across the Poland-Ukraine border. However, the new approach involves storing the shipments at a military base near the airport, which is currently used by the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. For over 3 years, Zaporizhzhia Airport has served as a critical logistics hub for international military aid to Ukraine. Reporters observed the arrival of a Boeing 747 cargo plane operated by National Airlines, a Pentagon contractor, at the airport. Additionally, a convoy of over 20 trucks was seen leaving the airport and heading toward the Ukrainian border. This suggests that, despite temporary storage, Ukraine remains the final destination for these shipments, as the conflict with Russia continues. U.S. alters military aid approach to Ukraine. Experts believe that this new distribution method may reflect adjustments in the U.S. approach to military aid. Since taking office in late January, U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly emphasized the need to reevaluate the volume and method of support for Kyiv. In early March, the Trump administration suspended direct intelligence sharing and halted military aid to Ukraine, raising concerns among Kyiv and its European allies. However, according to local reporters, this does not mean the complete cessation of aid. Instead, Washington is shifting to a more controlled distribution system, in which the U.S. military base in Poland plays a key intermediary role. U.S. may resume intelligence sharing with Ukraine soon. On March 9th, speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, President Trump announced that the U.S. has nearly lifted the freeze on intelligence sharing with Ukraine, but did not provide further details. Trump also expressed optimism about the upcoming negotiations between Washington and Kiev in Saudi Arabia. According to the plan, U.S. and Ukrainian delegations will meet in Jeddah on March 11th to discuss the framework for a potential peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Washington aims to use the meeting to assess Ukraine's willingness to make key concessions to Russia in pursuit of a resolution to the conflict. Ukraine sets conditions for lifting sanctions. Russia considers measures to ease economic pressure. Ukraine's conditions for lifting sanctions. As efforts to end the ongoing conflict continue, Ukraine has recently outlined conditions for the potential lifting of sanctions imposed on Russia by the West. According to Vlad Vus, Commissioner for Sanctions Policy under Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the resumption of economic cooperation with Russia is only a matter of time, but it must occur under appropriate conditions. In an interview with Politico published on March 17th, Vus emphasized that economic restrictions, embargoes, and bans on Russian energy imports serve a specific purpose: to push Moscow to end its military operations and reach a long-term peace agreement rather than simply imposing punitive measures. He stated, "At present, it is too early to discuss lifting any sanctions. We only want to ensure that Russia takes significant steps in this direction before any discussions on easing sanctions take place." Vus did not rule out the possibility of European countries signing new agreements to purchase Russian oil and gas if and when the war in Ukraine ends. Russia has great potential, particularly in the energy sector, and it would be a mistake not to take advantage of it. However, we hope that Europe will never find itself entirely dependent on Russian energy in any form. Russia considers measures to ease sanctions. In a related development, Reuters reported on March 13th that the Kremlin is asking domestic companies to identify the sanctions that need to be lifted most urgently. This move comes as U.S. President Donald Trump has warned of stricter sanctions if Russia does not engage in negotiations, while also hinting at the possibility of easing restrictions if Moscow agrees to a ceasefire in Ukraine. A source in the Russian industrial sector told Reuters that the Ministry of Industry and Trade is distributing forms for businesses to fill out, asking them to specify which sanctions have had the greatest impact on their operations. According to the source, payment-related issues remain the most significant obstacle. Several businesses have reported rising transaction costs due to the need to use alternative currencies instead of the US dollar, making financial transactions more expensive and complicated. Additionally, 3 other sources highlighted energy-related sanctions, particularly restrictions on Russia's oil tanker fleet. When asked about the specific sanctions that Russia wants to be eased, the Kremlin stated that it considers all sanctions to be illegal and that they should be lifted entirely. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters, "These issues are part of ongoing negotiations, and I want to reiterate that there is no reason to rush into any conclusions." NATO suggests normalizing relations with Russia. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently suggested the possibility of normalizing relations with Moscow. In an interview with Bloomberg on March 13th, Rutte stated that it is natural for the conflict to de-escalate step by step for Europe and the US. And similarly, restoring normal relations with Russia should be approached cautiously and with a clear roadmap. France and the UK propose establishing a voluntary alliance to support Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron recently revealed details regarding the mission of a military support force for Ukraine, which France, the UK, and other allied nations are working together to establish. This force, named the Voluntary Alliance, could be deployed once a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine takes effect. Speaking to the press ahead of an online summit hosted by the UK on March 15th, President Macron emphasized that the plan does not involve deploying a large number of troops to Ukraine. Instead, military forces will be strategically positioned in key areas. According to French newspapers Le Figaro and Le Parisien, Macron stated that participating countries could deploy several thousand soldiers to strategic locations in Ukraine. The primary missions of this force would include training Ukrainian troops and supporting defensive operations, demonstrating a long-term commitment to Kyiv. Macron also highlighted that the proposed military units from NATO member states would serve as a security guarantee for Ukraine. Several European and non-European nations have expressed willingness to join this force if it is established. Le Parisien quoted Macron affirming that this deployment does not require Russia's approval. The French president stated, "Ukraine is a sovereign country. If they request allied forces to be present on their territory, Russia has no authority to decide against it." UK Prime Minister challenges Russian president to sign ceasefire agreement. Following the 2-hour online meeting, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer reportedly challenged Russian President Vladimir Putin to sign a ceasefire agreement if he is genuinely committed to peace. Starmer also asserted that the Western coalition would continue to increase pressure on the Kremlin, including preparing peacekeeping forces for deployment during the ceasefire implementation phase. Approximately 30 world leaders participated in the meeting, including Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and representatives from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, as well as officials from NATO and the European Union, EU. This was the second such meeting in 2 weeks, aimed at helping Ukraine navigate shifting U.S. policies following Donald Trump's return to the White House, while assessing international support for potential peacekeeping missions in the future. According to Prime Minister Starmer, military experts will reconvene in the UK on March 20th to further discuss plans for future security assistance to Ukraine. President Putin briefed on pipeline operation in Kursk. During a visit to the command headquarters in Kursk province on March 12th, Russian President Vladimir Putin received a briefing on the military operation in the region and praised the Russian armed forces for their effectiveness. Russia's rapid assault in Kursk, including the pipeline operation, successfully cut off Ukraine's supply routes, leaving Kyiv's forces encircled and in disarray. Russia has recently intensified counterattacks in Kursk, an area that was targeted by Ukrainian forces in August last year. In his report to President Putin, Russian Army Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov highlighted the heroic actions of the coordinated attack units, which included volunteer battalions and veteran forces. According to Gerasimov, over 600 troops used a gas pipeline to traverse approximately 15 kilometers, infiltrating Ukrainian defensive positions in a covert raid. Surprise infiltration strategy disrupts Ukrainian defenses. A specially trained unit executed the infiltration by traveling through an abandoned gas pipeline. This pipeline, which previously transported Russian gas to Europe, was shut down by Ukraine on January 1, 2025. General Gerasimov stated that this maneuver caught the enemy off guard, leading to the collapse of their defensive network and facilitating Russia's advance in Kursk. President Putin commended Russian soldiers, including the 11th Air Assault Brigade, the 30th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, and the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, for their bold and efficient execution of the mission. Additionally, over 10 other units and task forces were recognized for their role in reclaiming key territories in Kursk. Operation planned for months, executed with precision. The pipeline operation had been meticulously planned for several months before being launched in early March. The primary objective was to initiate offensive maneuvers in Ukrainian-controlled areas, forcing Kyiv's forces to retreat from strategic positions and withdraw towards Svatove, where Russian troops had already been positioned for an ambush. On March 1st, oxygen tanks were delivered to the operation staging area. The following day, Russian troops began moving through the pipeline in small groups toward the town of Svatove. The journey, which took several days, required navigating through confined spaces with limited airflow, demanding extreme endurance and skill. Due to oxygen shortages inside the pipeline, technical teams installed temporary ventilation systems and drilled air holes to facilitate movement. Although the pipeline was wide, it was not tall enough for soldiers to stand upright, forcing them to crouch as they moved. Essential supplies such as water and rations were transported via pulley systems, while soldiers wore specialized protective gear to avoid exposure to residual gases. March 8th, attack plunges Ukraine into chaos. After days of covert movement, Russian troops awaited their attack orders. On March 8th, they simultaneously emerged from pre-prepared exits and swiftly seized key positions. Russian units were then dispersed, advancing into Svatova's industrial sector and surrounding settlements. The unexpected operation caught Ukrainian forces off guard. Despite attempts to resist, Ukrainian troops were swiftly overpowered or forced to retreat, leaving behind military equipment. Russian reinforcements, including armored vehicles and artillery, were rapidly deployed to support the operation. Military analyst Eval Kilim stated the Ukrainian forces were completely unprepared. About 30 minutes after the Russian troops emerged, Ukraine began bombarding the pipeline with cluster munitions. However, by then, Russian troops had already secured the area and fortified their positions, causing widespread panic among the enemy ranks. This is not the first time Russia has used pipeline infiltration tactics. A similar operation took place in January 2024, when Russian reconnaissance forces entered Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka, Donetsk, through an abandoned tunnel.
Russia and Ukraine intensify UAV attacks, partial ceasefire negotiations underway.
On March 20th, Ukraine's Air Force Command reported that Russia launched a large-scale UAV attack targeting various locations across Ukraine using a total of 171 drones starting early that morning. The assault prompted authorities to issue nationwide air raid alerts. As of 8:30 a.m. local time, 12:30 p.m. Vietnam time, Ukrainian air defenses had reportedly shot down 75 drones over the regions of Kharkiv, Poltava, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, Kirovohrad, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. The Ukrainian Air Force added that 63 of the Russian UAVs were decoy drones, which caused no damage on the ground. Ukraine did not comment on the remaining 33 drones, suggesting they may have reached their targets. Ukrainian media reported multiple explosions across the country during the drone attacks. In Kirovohrad province, central Ukraine, 21 Russian UAVs struck the city of Kropyvnytsky, damaging several buildings and injuring 10 people. However, Ukraine did not disclose whether military facilities were affected. Meanwhile, Russia's Ministry of Defense confirmed that 132 Ukrainian UAVs were intercepted over Russian airspace during the night of March 20th, including 54 over Saratov region. According to RIA Novosti, debris from a Ukrainian drone shattered windows at a hospital in the city of Engels, Saratov, injuring one woman. Around noon, Saratov Governor Roman Basargin reported a fire at a nearby military airfield, though no further details were provided. Russia and Ukraine have been conducting near-daily UAV strikes against each other's targets. The latest attacks came shortly after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump, during which Zelensky agreed to a Russian proposal for a 30-day pause in attacks on each other's energy infrastructure. According to the New York Times, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States are in talks to determine the timing, implementation, and monitoring mechanisms for the partial ceasefire. Some sources expect the initiative to begin in April 2025.
Trump acknowledges efforts to push for a ceasefire to prevent conflict escalation. On March 18, in an interview with Fox News, U.S. President Donald Trump admitted that his push for a broader ceasefire stemmed from his desire to keep American forces out of a potentially escalating conflict. He warned that if the war in Ukraine escalated into World War III, Americans might inevitably become involved. "We are doing everything to ensure that no Americans participate in this conflict. But that could change if the war escalates into World War III. That would be a terrible situation," President Trump emphasized. His interview came shortly after a nearly 2-hour phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump described the conversation as excellent and revealed that the two leaders had discussed numerous peace-related issues, along with other important topics. "I believe Russia wants to have a good relationship with the United States," Trump stated. During the call, President Putin agreed to suspend attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days but did not accept the broader ceasefire proposal put forth by the United States. Shortly thereafter, the Kremlin issued a statement demanding that Ukraine cease receiving military aid from foreign countries as a prerequisite for a ceasefire. On social media, President Trump stated that he and President Putin had agreed to work swiftly toward achieving a comprehensive ceasefire and ultimately ending the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. He also revealed that several aspects of a potential peace agreement were discussed, including the growing number of casualties on the battlefield. Both President Vladimir Putin of Russia and President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine want to see this conflict come to an end, Trump emphasized. "The peace process is fully underway, and I hope it will achieve the desired goal."